Welcome to The Explainer. So, have you ever walked into a church and felt like you were stepping into, well, a rock concert rather than a traditional sanctuary? To kick things off today, we're going to explore a really fascinating shift: the move from traditional wooden pews and massive pipe organs to electric guitars and smartphone giving apps. We're going to uncover the precise philosophy driving this modern church experience. Because if you've stepped into a contemporary church anytime recently, you've absolutely noticed that things look, sound, and feel completely different than they did a few decades ago. Today, we're unpacking exactly why that is, tracing the incredibly powerful ideas that literally transformed the modern worship service from the ground up.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start by defining the seeker, then look at transforming worship and atmosphere, move into preaching to felt needs, trace the historical roots and pioneers, and finally, we'll unpack the core theological debate. Let's get right into it.
Part 1. Defining the seeker, a brand new perspective on churchgoers.
At its core, a seeker is just a term used to identify someone who attends church but isn't actually a Christian. Now, you might be thinking, why use the specific word? Well, proponents of the seeker-sensitive movement argue that this label is incredibly important. Why? Because it conveys a much more positive, optimistic view of visitors. It fundamentally assumes these individuals are actively looking for answers, That implies a journey, a mutual discovery, and this is vastly different from identifying them simply by their lack of faith with a traditional, heavier term like unbeliever. Think about the psychology here for a second. Changing the vocabulary shifts the entire power dynamic from an us versus them mentality to a far more welcoming, hey, we're all on a path together mindset. It essentially turns an outsider into a guest on a spiritual journey. The thing is, many visitors face some deeply rooted anxieties and hurdles when walking through those church doors. Research actually suggests that seekers often share a common, pretty hesitant perspective. Many have had genuinely negative experiences with Christians or churches in the past. Others are just inherently skeptical of the institutional church, or, what they might call organized religion. Put yourself in their shoes for a minute. Imagine being that skeptical, first-time visitor. You walk into a building feeling highly guarded, maybe feeling judged by the sheer weight of institutional religion, and you find traditional elements, like archaic hymns, unspoken rules about exactly when you're supposed to stand or sit, or heavily theological jargon, to be totally alienating. Understanding this specific mindset, this visceral feeling of just not belonging, is the absolute crucial key that unlocks exactly why these churches have made such drastic, sweeping changes.
Section 2. Transforming worship and atmosphere, the sensory shift. So, to reach these skeptical visitors, churches purposefully alter their physical environments to make them feel completely at home. They create a tangible shift toward a live entertainment atmosphere that's designed for absolute comfort and contemporary relevance. If a visitor is nervous about a stiff, formal religious setting, seeker-sensitive churches remove that barrier entirely. You won't find a traditional choir in robes or an imposing pipe organ. Nope. Instead, you get highly skilled modern worship bands with electric guitars and drum kits. The heavy hymnals? Gone. They're replaced with easily readable, perfectly synced lyrics projected on massive LED screens. The whole sensory experience is completely flipped. The house lights are dimmed and the stage is brightly illuminated, basically mimicking the familiar, non-threatening environment of a rock concert or maybe a TED-Con. The leaders dress casually in jeans and sneakers rather than formal suits, signaling, hey, you don't need to dress up to belong here. The hard wooden pews are swapped out for comfortable padded chairs. And remember that anxiety we talked about earlier? Think about the intense pressure a non-believer feels when a velvet offering plate is passed directly in front of them, literally asking for money. These modern churches engineer that friction right out of existence by replacing it with simple, low-pressure smartphone giving apps. Every single detail is meticulously designed to remove friction for the outsider.
Section 3. Preaching to felt needs, a change in the message.
But here's the thing, the transformation isn't just sensory, it deeply affects the content delivered from the pulpit too. The crucial point here is the shift from preaching on complex doctrinal topics to focusing entirely on practical, everyday concerns. In a traditional service, you usually find expository preaching. Basically, it's a systematic, verse-by-verse interpretation of Scripture focusing on rich theological reflections. A sermon title might be something like The Doctrine of Justification in Romans, dealing with weighty concepts like original sin or the exclusivity of faith. But seeker-sensitive preaching takes a wildly different route. It heavily utilizes topical preaching. The goal here is individual empowerment, addressing what are known as felt needs. To put that into perspective, instead of a deep dive into ancient theology, the sermon is designed to meet the visitor right where they are on a random Tuesday afternoon. The sermon title transforms into something highly relatable, like 5 Steps to a Stress-Free Family, or How to Manage Your Money with Purpose. It covers highly practical, immediate topics like personal finance, overcoming daily anxiety, or effective parenting. It's a communication approach built for sure on immediate, real-world resonance rather than theological deep dives.
Section 4. Historical Roots and Pioneers, Tracing the Lineage.
Now, you might think this is an entirely new phenomenon born out of the megachurch boom of the 1980s or 90s, but the desire to accommodate the outsider actually goes back much, much further. In fact, the concept of adapting a service for the non-Christian visitor dates back to the very first century. No way, right? But it's true. The Apostle Paul famously advised the early church in Corinth to be incredibly mindful of their guests. In 1 Corinthians, he wrote that they should prioritize understandable prophecy over speaking in tongues. Why? Because he explicitly warned them that if outsiders or unbelievers walked into a chaotic, confusing service, they would look around and think everyone was literally out of their minds. There is a profound irony and honestly a brilliant surprise in realizing that today's laser lights and smoke machines actually share a philosophical DNA with 2,000-year-old biblical advice about making the gathering accessible to the outsider.
Tracing this to the modern era, we see a really clear lineage of leaders who championed this specific approach to church growth. In the mid-20th century, we had Robert Schuller at the Crystal Cathedral. His focus on highly positive, uplifting preaching definitely laid the groundwork for the felt needs approach. Then came Bill Hybels, widely regarded as the true pioneer of the seeker-sensitive movement. When Hybels was starting Willow Creek Community Church in the 1970s, he and his team didn't just guess what people wanted. They literally went door to door in their Chicago suburbs, surveying unchurched people, explicitly asking them why they didn't attend church. The answers they got, that churches were boring, always asking for money, or just completely irrelevant to daily life, directly informed their entire groundbreaking model. Today, that legacy is carried on and adapted by highly influential modern leaders like Rick Warren, Andy Stanley, and Joel Osteen. What were once distinct markers of a niche experimental movement have now just become commonplace, everyday practices in thousands of churches globally.
Section 5. The Core Theological Debate. Target the seeker or edify the believer. As these practices have become so widespread, they've also sparked considerable ongoing debate among Christians today. At the core of this disagreement is a fundamental tension of purpose. On one side, those who advocate for targeting seekers argue that the church absolutely must prioritize supreme hospitality and the mandate to evangelize the lost. They believe that removing barriers for visitors is the ultimate act of love and obedience to the Great Commission. On the flip side, proponents of focusing on edifying Christians argue that the primary purpose of the Sunday gathering is to build up the believers. They express deep concern that making services entirely comfortable for the outsider might inadvertently starve the core members of the church of deep spiritual growth. The fear is that by constantly focusing on entry-level practical advice, the church risks compromising the gospel or diluting rich, essential biblical teaching. It is a genuine, difficult tension between prioritizing broad outreach and maintaining theological depth.
Yet, even amidst this fierce debate, it is so important to recognize the profound common ground. Ultimately, despite their differing views on what the music, the lighting, or the sermon on a Sunday morning should actually look like, both sides share a foundational goal: making disciples of all nations. If churches on both sides of this methodological divide share the Apostle Paul's genuine heart for the unbeliever, there remains a deep optimism that seekers will ultimately hear the message and have the chance to respond to it. And you know, this dynamic isn't just limited to churches. It's totally worth asking yourself how you view your own community, organizations, clubs, or groups. Do they prioritize the comfort of the insider who's been there for years, or do they prioritize rolling out the red carpet for the brand new outsider? It really is a universal tension.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. How should modern faith balance welcoming the outsider with teaching the insider? It's a delicate balancing act that every congregation has to navigate in a rapidly changing world. The next time you take a seat, whether it's on a padded chair under stage lights or a wooden pew next to a pipe organ, ask yourself, who is this room really built for? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer as we explored the fascinating dynamics of the seeker movement. I hope this gives you a much clearer lens the next time you walk through those doors.